Hi, I want to talk to you about employer rights and responsibilities. Equivalently, employee responsibilities and rights. We tend to think that the employment relationship carries a fair number of ethical obligations. One person's right is another person's responsibility. A right of an employee is a responsibility for the employer. Conversely, a right of the employer is responsibility of the employee. So if we ask what rights do employees have, we're tempted to say, well, the wages that have been agreed upon for the job, perhaps safe working conditions, the respect of management, adequate supervision, adequate training. We might say perhaps things that are more detailed like breaks of various kinds, lunch breaks and so on. And in general, we're going to think there are some responsibilities that an employer has toward an employee. But conversely, you might say the employer has certain rights too. The employee has an obligation to do the work they've agreed to do it in a way that follows the general tone and direction of the employer, to in short give the employer and the employer's rules a certain amount of respect. And all of those things are things that, to sort out carefully, we need to really think hard about what rights and responsibilities are. So before we can answer the question, what are employees' and employers' rights and responsibilities, we need to think, what are rights and responsibilities in general? Now that's a hard question. And so what we're going to do is take a look at a number of different ethical theories and analyze the way that they think about rights and responsibilities and see what that might imply about the employer-employee relationship. As you know, my general philosophy is not that of a great many philosophers. They tend to think of these ethical theories as competitors and ethics as something like a war or a contest among the various theories. Are we Kantian? Are we virtue ethicists? Are we consequentialists? And I don't view it that way at all. I think of each of these theories as identifying important dimensions of moral thinking. So the virtue ethicist is right that the question of what kind of person I should be is a fundamental ethical question. The consequentialist question, what are the effects of this action? What are the consequences likely to be? Is a very important ethical question. The Kantian questions, wait, are we treating everyone the same here? Are we giving everyone respect as a moral agent? Are we respecting their autonomy? Those are important moral questions. And then there are all sorts of moral questions that are embedded within specific relationships, like the employer-employee relationship. So we're going to talk about the approach of common sense ethics, about the approach of a Kantian, of consequentialists, of virtue ethicists, and also of role regulation theory, a role ethics that says the rights and responsibilities you have depend critically on your social role and specifically on the kind of relationship you have. So we'll then apply that to the employer-employee relationship and think about what it entails. Well, we can't do all that in one video. So in this video, I want to focus strictly on common sense ethics and think about what W.D. Ross's theory would imply about the nature of rights and responsibilities. According to Ross, the greatest Aristotle scholar, I think, of the 20th century, and someone who not only translated many of the works of Aristotle and wrote a great deal about Aristotle, but also developed a vaguely Aristotelian approach to ethics of his own, rests everything on prima facie principles. A prima facie principle is one that expresses, well, a prima facie obligation. What does that mean? Well, he says it would be a real obligation, an actual obligation, as long as there are no other morally relevant constraints operating. A prima facie principle expresses, in other words, a kind of generalization. We might say that stealing is wrong, and we mean stealing in general is wrong. Stealing unless there are other moral considerations that would mandate it and require it is wrong. Now, could there be other such conditions? Well, in principle, yes. The classic case of stealing the bread to feed your starving family. In speaking of Ross's theory, we want to talk about principles rather than rules. By a principle, I'll just mean something that can have exceptions. A rule, I'll tend to think of as something that does not have exceptions. So it's proper to think of his basic common sense principles, as things that do have exceptions. They may have to yield in the face of other moral considerations. Well, we've talked about the distinction, stemming from Cicero and various Stoic thinkers, between perfect and imperfect obligations. A perfect obligation is specific and it gives someone else rights. An imperfect obligation is still an obligation, but it allows the agent a considerable amount of choice, and it doesn't confer on anyone else any rights. A number of the principles that are in Ross are ones that seem to generate, at least primarily, imperfect obligations. And so we're going to set those aside. They're relevant to responsibilities, but not really to the specific responsibilities of an employer-employee relationship. So what are some of those? Well, to improve yourself, to help others, for example, to be grateful, to be thankful. These are things that are important principles, and they may well generate some perfect obligations in the context of particular relationships. But they're not the main ones that I want to talk about today. Those are tricky, I think, and subtle to bring out. What I want to do is talk about the other 4 principles that Ross talks about, that do, in a lot of cases at least, generate perfect obligations, and so real rights and responsibilities that we can then apply to the employer-employee relationship. The first is keep your promises. There are certain things I've done in the past that give me obligations, responsibilities now, and one of them is that I've made promises. I have, in the context that we're interested in, signed an employment contract. And so I've agreed to work for someone else for a certain amount of pay, for example. I have agreed to perform certain tasks. I've agreed to accept certain conditions under which I do them and receive certain benefits. And those are contractual obligations on both my part and the employer's part. So that does give us perfect obligations toward each other. It also generates rights. If I've done the job, I have a right to receive the pay that was agreed upon. And if the employer has paid me, the employer has a right that I actually live up to my end of the contract and do the job. So it would be clearly unjust, for example, if I take my paycheck and then simply run off and don't do the job. The employer has a right to have that job done by me. Now, there's subtle legal questions here. It might be that I actually may not be held legally responsible for what is called specific performance. That is to say, it might be that I've agreed to do this, and then I take off and do something else. I accept another job, for example. Well, the employer could sue me and demand compensation, and that brings us to the next principle. But it might be that my responsibility can't really be fulfilled in the original form, and doesn't technically have to be, but I still owe the employer something. Now, I said that brought us to the second principle, which is to make amends. If I've done something wrong, to set it right again. Sometimes there isn't something specific I have to do. I have to, in effect, convey an apology. But in the context of an employer-employee relationship, and in many other relationships, it may be something much more specific. So to take the example I mentioned, suppose I agree to do the job and then I don't do it. Well, I now may be in a position where I actually can't do it. But nevertheless, you might say, I am responsible. I am responsible for compensating the other person I entered into that contract with. I had an obligation to keep my promises, and if I can't keep my promise, then it turns out that I owe compensation. I should set the situation right, either by doing the job myself, or if that's not something I am willing or able to do, then to provide other forms of compensation. So that is another sort of right and responsibility that arises out of this relationship. The employer has a right to certain work from me. If I can't do it, then I may well have a responsibility to compensate the employer, to pay back that salary, for example, that I could no longer justify by performing the task that was agreed upon. There are a lot of situations where this can arise in business relationships. It's maybe not so obvious in employer-employee relationships, but it becomes clear in other kinds of contracts, where people really have a very strong incentive to want to be allowed out of the contract. They can't be forced, usually, to do what the contract agrees upon, but on the other hand, they can be forced to pay compensation to make amends for their failure to perform a responsibility under the contract. A third principle that seems very important in this connection is be fair, promote justice. That is a basic principle in Ross's system, and it's something that generates perfect obligations. I have an obligation to be fair in my dealings with the employer. The employer has an obligation to be fair to me. And so there are rights and responsibilities arising out of that. We have a responsibility to treat others fairly and in general to try to promote fairness around us. We also have a right to fair treatment. And so if my employer treats me unfairly in various ways, then it may be that that violates my rights. So what would this mean in practice? Well, one thing it might mean is that employers cannot discriminate, for example. They can't treat people differently when they're similarly situated and doing the job in a similar way. It may also mean that employers and employees must be fair to each other in a more fundamental sense. Not only that the same rules get applied across the board, but that those rules themselves be fair. Ross thought that fairness requires, as Aristotle thought, a kind of proportionality. People deserve a reward that is correlative, that is proportional to their merit. And in the context of an employment relationship, that generally means that promotion should go to the best people, the most qualified people, the people most likely to do a good job in that new position. It means that raises should go to those who deserve those raises, and so on. And so if two people are doing much the same job, but one is constantly getting rewarded and the other is getting penalized, you might say, wait, that's not fair. It's partly that the same rule isn't being applied, but you might also think, look, this company isn't being fair to any employee. Maybe nobody is really getting paid what they're worth. Maybe everybody's being exploited. Or conversely, it might be that the employer is being treated unfairly. Everybody's a slacker. Nobody's really doing their work. And so it's not just a matter of applying the same rule across the board. That's a kind of Kantian conception of fairness, and that's part of it. But part of it is a more substantive conception. You should actually have the way you're treated in this relationship proportional to how well you're doing. And that's something that is a responsibility on both the employer's part and the employee's part. The employees owe something to the employer and should be fair in those dealings, just as the employer should be fair to the employees. Well, there's one final rule that I think generates perfect obligations in an obvious way, and that is don't harm other people. That seems clear enough. Now, it's relatively rare these days that employers harm their workers, but of course, I speak from the point of view of somebody in a developed country with a great deal of regulation about the employment relationship. It hasn't always been so. Some employers have treated their own employees very, very badly, putting them in conditions of high risk, for example, without the employee's consent, or maybe just treating them very, very poorly within that relationship, doing things that harm them, maybe creating conditions, even unknowingly, that end up harming the workers. Those are things that shouldn't be done. Those are violations of responsibilities. I have a right as an employee not to be harmed by my employer. Now, I'm a college professor. I'm rarely placed in conditions of physical danger. And so the odds of my employer doing something that harm me are relatively small. However, not everyone is in such a fortunate position. If I were a coal miner, for example, as one of my great-grandfathers was, or a steel worker, as another one was, I could be placed in conditions of serious physical danger. And then that obligation not to be harmed by the conditions under which I'm working, not to be harmed by my employer, would be much more significant and much more salient. And so this is something that matters a great deal. How much it matters in a given relationship depends on the nature of the job. Sometimes the job is dangerous for one reason or another, and it really does matter. Now, in our current circumstance with the coronavirus, this is something that takes on an added significance. If you might be sick, you really need to stay away from other people. That's generally true. If you're sick, stay home. Don't endanger others in your workplace. But when it's a really serious illness, that's all the more important. That would be an example of an obligation that an employee has, not only to the employer, but to the other employees around them. And indeed, when we start thinking about these relationships, we realize that Ross's principles don't only give us rights and responsibilities with respect to that employer-employee relationship. They also suggest some important things about rights and responsibilities that coworkers have toward one another. And so employees don't just have obligations to the employer, they have obligations to other employees. And managers, people who are working for someone higher in the organization, but also have employees working for them and supervising them, those people have responsibilities and rights going in both directions. Responsibilities toward the employer, also responsibilities toward the various people they supervise. And we'll get into the details of that much more when we think about specific relationships and examine role regulation theory. Let's reflect on where we've been. There are 4 basic principles in Ross that generate, rather uncontroversially, perfect obligations, that generate rights and responsibilities for employees and employers. Don't harm one another. Be fair to one another. Keep your promises. And make amends for anything that's gone wrong. Those give people rights, they also give people responsibilities, and they are fundamental to understanding the employer-employee relationship. Let's think about the nature of rights and responsibilities in a system of common sense ethics like Ross's. There are certain conceptions of rights that imply that rights are trumps. That is to say, they always win. If somebody has a right to something, then that must be done no matter what. Well, there is nothing in Ross's system that's really like that. All of these are prima facie principles having to do with prima facie obligation, which is another way of saying that they are things that must be done if no other moral considerations intervene. One way to think about this is to say, according to Ross, any obligation, any responsibility, but also any right can have defeaters. There can be situations in which that right does not apply, in which the right doesn't turn out to be the most important moral consideration in the context. So, is it always the case that rights should be respected? Is it always the case that we should be just? Ross says, well, almost always. Generally it's true. However, there can be exceptions. There might be situations where injustice is the only way to survive. There might be situations where things press on us so intensely from one direction that actually we are able to, for example, violate a promise, or we are able to cause harm to someone else, or we are able to leave wrongs uncorrected, simply because the alternative is even worse from a moral point of view. Well, we can be a little more careful than that. What kinds of defeaters are there? The ones that I've had in mind in those examples are overriding defeaters, where there is another moral consideration that's even more important. So, for example, and this is an example in Ross, I've promised to meet a friend for lunch. Remember when it was possible to actually meet friends for lunch? I'm on my way and I see an accident, and I realize I'm the only person around to help. So I go rushing over to help the people who were injured in the accident. It looks like that's more important an obligation than meeting my friend for lunch. And so that's a situation where I really ought to stay and help the accident victims. I've actually been in that kind of situation. I had promised to be somewhere, and on the way I witnessed an accident. Luckily in this case no one was injured, but on the other hand it was a bizarre accident, and I thought it was very important that I be there for the police to explain as an eyewitness just what happened in that accident. I thought that was a more important obligation than the obligation to be where I said I would be, when I said I would be. And so that kind of situation going to happen. I have a real responsibility there, and someone else has a right to my performance. But in this case, something else overrides it. Something else is more important. There can also be undercutting defeaters, where something happens that simply removes the conditions under which that would apply. I've promised to meet my friend for lunch, for example, and then the friend calls up and says, hey, listen, I'm really busy at work. Can we postpone this and do it next week instead? I'm relieved of my obligation. My obligation now has been undercut by that consideration. In this case, my friend letting me out of the promise. There might be other conditions like that, where I am on my, let's say I'm trying to start the car and I realize my car won't start. And then I say, well, I better call my friend. It turns out my phone is dead. Well, okay, I still have an obligation to make amends to my friend, to apologize when I see him and so on. But on the other hand, you might say, well, now the conditions under which I can fulfill this are no longer there. This has been undercut. I still have some kind of moral obligation, but it's no longer an obligation to do that specific thing, just as I would owe my friend an apology for not going there because I had to help accident victims or give a report to the police. Jonathan Dancy has talked about other kinds of considerations here as well. There can be attenuators and intensifiers. So there might be some things that make my obligation even greater or that reduce it. Don't get rid of it altogether, but reduce it. So let's say, for example, in that case, my car won't start. Well, it's much more difficult now for me to meet my friend. but I guess I could call a cab, or I could walk. It's a couple of miles, but I barely have time. Okay, what should I do in that situation? You might say, the obligation isn't gone. It's not like I can't get there. But on the other hand, it's surely reduced. It has been attenuated in some way. There's a condition now that makes it harder to fulfill. And you might say, my friend is going to be much more understanding now, because there's something that, while it didn't remove the responsibility, made it seem a little less. But on the other hand, it could be intensified. It could be that I'm sitting right across the street from some other restaurant. I was supposed to leave and go meet my friend at some more distant place, but the friend calls up and says, hey, actually it's more convenient for me to go to the one right across the street. And so I say, yeah, sure, I'll be there. And then I don't go. That somehow makes it worse, right? Look, it was so easy for me to fulfill it. That seems to intensify my obligation. There are examples like this in Thompson's famous paper on abortion, where the idea is what if somebody could save a life by just walking across the room and putting his cool hand on her fevered brow, and the person doesn't do it? Whatever responsibility you might think there is there, it's surely intensified by the fact that it's an incredibly easy thing to do. And so we should take those kinds of considerations into account as well. And in the employer-employee relationship, there might be similar kinds of things. The employer asks me to do something. Maybe that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Well, it's possible for me to do it, but it's really hard. And the difficulty seems to, in some way, attenuate my responsibility here. It's easier to excuse a failure to do it. If, on the other hand, it's something incredibly easy to do, then it looks like, come on, that intensifies the responsibility I have to do it. So there can be a variety of things, not just ease and difficulty, that are going to attenuate or intensify an obligation. And all of that is relevant when we think about responsibilities, especially when we think about various kinds of responsibilities we have, and tough choice situations where we have to actually select among them. I can't both help the accident victim or report to the police and also be where I said I would be at that time. And so I have to make a choice. Which responsibility is greater? Which is the greater obligation? Ross asks. And those are often critical ethical questions. So all of those considerations, overriding, undercutting, intensifying, attenuating, all of those matter for assessing, in the end, what we really ought to do.